The late afternoon sun hung low over Riverside Park, casting a warm amber glow across the jogging paths and scattered picnic tables. Officer Isabella Torres walked along the gravel path, her boots crunching softly with every step beside her. Her canine partner Rex moved with sharp precision, his ears perked and his eyes scanning every movement. The German shepherd's tail swayed calmly, but his body carried the coiled tension of an animal, always ready for action. "Easy day today, Rex," Isabella said, softly, adjusting her sunglasses as she glanced out over the expanse of green. No sirens, no screaming, just us. Rex's ears twitched in response, but his eyes were locked on something ahead, a patch of earth just beyond the main trail, partially hidden by a cluster of overgrown bushes. His pace slowed, and then without warning, he froze. Rex Isabella's voice sharpened as she stopped in her tracks. "What is it, buddy?" Rex let out a low growl, the sound rumbling from deep within his chest. Before she could say another word, the dog broke into a sprint, charging toward the brush. "Rex, heel," Isabella shouted, but he didn't stop. The joggers and park goers around her paused, turning their heads to follow the blur of fur disappearing into the bushes. Isabella swore under her breath, and followed. Her hand rested on the grip of her service weapon, her instincts flaring to life by the time she caught up. Rex was digging furiously into the earth, his powerful paws tearing through damp soil. The dog's growl deepened as he uncovered something solid. Beneath the surface, a fragment of wood, weathered and stained. "Rex, easy." Isabella knelt beside him, pulling him back gently by his harness. Dirt stained her palms as she brushed away the remaining soil, revealing what appeared to be a small wooden box, partially splintered and covered in mealu. Her stomach tightened. She slipped on a pair of latex gloves from her utility belt and carefully pried open the box inside. She found a stack of photographs yellowed at the edges and a small collection of documents folded neatly beneath them. But what made her breath catch in her throat was the tarnished police badge lying on top, stained with dried blood. Officer James Callahan. The name hit her like a freight train. Callahan had been one of theirs, an officer who'd gone missing 2 years ago under mysterious circumstances. The official story was that he'd walked away from his life, burned out and disillusioned, but everyone in the precinct had whispered otherwise. She quickly gathered the box and its contents, carefully placing everything into an evidence bag from her kit. Rex stood beside her, his head low, his amber eyes locked onto hers, as if he could sense the storm brewing in her chest. "Good boy, Rex," she said softly, her voice tight. "You found something big, something they didn't want anyone to find." Isabella stood and scanned the area. The joggers and park visitors had long since moved on, their attention diverted, but something prickled at the back of her neck, a deep, crawling sensation that told her someone was watching. She glanced toward a nearby tree line and caught the faintest glimmer of movement, a shadow pulling back, disappearing into the woods. She didn't hesitate, with the evidence bag clutched tightly in one hand and Rex's harness gripped in the other. Isabella turned and walked briskly back toward her patrol car, parked near the entrance of the park. The interior of the patrol car felt suffocating. Isabella placed the evidence bag carefully on the passenger seat, her gloved hands still trembling. Rex sat in the back seat, his gaze fixed out the window, still on high alert, with her phone balanced on her knee. She scrolled through her contacts and hesitated over one name: Noah Grant, her old training officer. He'd been retired for over a year now, living off the grid just outside of town. If anyone could make sense of this, it was him. But before she could hit the call button, her phone buzzed with an incoming text. The message was short, cold, and terrifying. "Stop digging." Torres' last warning. Her breath caught in her throat, her eyes darted toward the rearview mirror, scanning the empty street behind her. No cars, no pedestrians, just the faint flicker of a streetlight overhead. "Rex," she said softly, her voice steady despite the adrenaline flooding her veins. "We're not going home tonight." The German shepherd let out a low huff in response, as if he understood every word. Isabella turned the key in the ignition, her patrol car rumbling to life. She pulled out of the lot, her eyes sharp as she merged onto the main road. The evidence bag beside her seemed to pulse with weight, like it carried not just documents and photographs, but the fate of everything she had worked for, somewhere in the shadows of Riverside. Someone was watching, someone was waiting, and whatever secrets were buried in that box, they were worth killing for, as the city lights blurred past the windshield. One thought echoed in Isabella's mind. They know when they're coming. The low hum of the engine was the only sound as Isabella guided her patrol car through the empty streets of Riverside. The glow of passing streetlights washed over her face, in intervals casting sharp lines of shadow and light across her furrowed brow. Rex sat alert in the back seat, his amber eyes locked on the world outside, ears twitching at every sound. Her phone sat face up in the passenger seat, the ominous text message still glowing on the screen. "Stop digging." Torres' last warning. Her stomach tightened as she glanced at the evidence bag beside it. The box, the badge, the photographs. It was all there, like a ticking bomb waiting to go off. "Where do we go, boy?" she muttered under her breath, gripping the wheel tighter. Rex let out a low huff, his breath fogging up the window. She needed answers, but she couldn't go back to the precinct. Not yet. Not with those photographs, not with that text message echoing in her head. There was only one person she could trust right now, Noah Grant. Noah had been her training officer, the one who taught her how to listen to her gut and trust the evidence. He'd retired a year ago after a messy case that nearly cost him his life. Now he lived off-grid in a rundown cabin near the outskirts of town. Isabella turned onto a gravel road, the car's tires crunching loudly in the silence. Fog drifted low across the trees, swallowing the headlights as the road narrowed. She killed the engine in front of Noah's cabin, the faint glow of light leaking from behind thick curtains. The night was cold and heavy with moisture as she stepped out of the car. Rex leapt down gracefully, landing beside her with sharp focus knocking. Twice she waited, her hand resting near her holstered Glock. The door creaked open slightly and Noah's lined face appeared through the crack. His sharp blue eyes softened when they landed on her. "Isa, what the hell are you doing out here at this hour? We need to talk." Noah now. He glanced at Rex, then at the patrol car parked in the shadows with a sigh. He unlatched the door and stepped back. "Come in." Noah's cabin was cluttered but warm. Old case files were stacked on nearly every surface, and the smell of stale coffee hung in the air. Rex settled near the door, his head on his paws, but his eyes tracked every movement. Noah poured 2 mugs of coffee and handed one to her before sinking into a worn armchair. He studied her silently for a moment before speaking. "You look like hell, Torres." She didn't respond immediately. Instead, she reached into the evidence bag and pulled out the tarnished badge, setting it carefully on the coffee table. Noah's gaze locked onto it, his jaw tightening. "James Callahan." Isabella nodded, her voice low. Rex found it buried in Riverside Park. Along with this, she spread out the photographs and documents, each one damning evidence of a conspiracy that reached deep into the city's power structures. Noah's face grew pale as he sifted through them, his hands trembling slightly. "This is bad. Isa, real bad. These aren't just petty bribes. We're talking about deeper-rooted corruption. Judges, council members, high-ranking officers." He trailed off, shaking his head. "Someone killed Callahan for this," Isabella said quietly. "And they'll kill me for it too if they know I have it." Noah rubbed his face with one hand. Do you know how many people have been trying to bury this? How many lives have been destroyed to keep this quiet? She leaned forward, her elbows on her knees. I need your help. Noah, I can't trust anyone at the precinct. Someone sent me a text tonight, and they knew exactly what I found. He was silent for a long moment before he spoke again, his voice low and measured. There's a shipment coming in tonight midnight. Warehouse 17 down at the docks. If this network is still active, there'll be their money evidence, maybe even answers. It's a trap. Isabella said, her voice firm. Of course it's a trap, Noah replied, meeting her gaze. But it's our only chance to get something concrete, something they can't deny or sweep under the rug. Rex let out a low growl. The door. Noah froze his hand, hovering over his mug. Did you hear that? Isabella stood, slowly drawing her Glock. Rex was already on his feet, body rigid, head low. A faint creak sounded from the porch outside. Then another Noah grabbed a shotgun from under the couch, pumping at once as they both backed away from the window. Back door, Isabella whispered. But before they could move, the front window shattered in a hail of glass and gunfire. Get down! Noah roared, diving behind an overturned coffee table. Isabella fired blindly toward the broken window. The muzzle flash lighting up the dark room in bursts of white light. Rex barked furiously, his growl cutting through the chaos. Go back door, Noah shouted again, firing off a round from his shotgun. Isabella grabbed the evidence bag and bolted toward the back. Rex following on her heels, bullets punched holes through the wooden walls, splinters exploding into the air. They burst into the cool night, the wet grass slick beneath their boots. Headlights flared up in the distance as an SUV roared to life. Run. Isabella shouted, her voice raw. Noah emerged behind her, shotgun in hand, firing another round toward the approaching vehicle before ducking behind a tree. Go, Issa! He bellowed. She hesitated for a split second, her eyes locking onto his. Go, she turned and ran, Rex keeping pace beside her, their shadows long under the cold moonlight. The distant crack of gunfire echoed through the trees behind them, and then a final deafening silence. Isabella didn't stop running until she reached her patrol car parked down the gravel road. She threw open the door, pushed Rex inside, and slammed it shut. Her chest heaved, her pulse roaring in her ears. Her phone buzzed again. In her pocket, another text message. You can't outrun this. Torres' tears stung her eyes, but she bit them back. Her teeth clenched tightly. Noah, she whispered. Her voice breaking, she gripped the steering wheel, her knuckles white, and turned the ignition. The patrol car's tires screeched as she peeled away into the night, leaving behind the cabin and Noah in the darkness. But the evidence was still with her, and whatever happened next, she couldn't stop. Now she wouldn't stop now. The first light of dawn crept over the horizon, casting a pale glow across the cracked windshield of Isabella's patrol car. She pulled off the road deep in the woods outside Riverside gravel, crunching under the tires as she brought the car to a stop near an old, overgrown picnic area. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the faint ticking of the cooling engine and Rex's soft panting from the back seat, his amber eyes locked onto her in the rearview mirror, filled with a mixture of exhaustion and trust. Isabella gripped the steering wheel, her knuckles white, as her breath came in. Shallow bursts, the events of the last few hours replayed in her head, the hail of bullets at Noah's cabin, his final shout telling her to run, and the cold finality of that last gunshot echoing in the trees. Noah, she whispered, her voice cracking. She let her head rest against the steering wheel, wheeled tears slipping silently down her cheeks. Rex let out a low whine, shifting forward to nudge her shoulder with his nose. Yeah, buddy, I know, she said softly, reaching back to scratch his ear. After a long moment, she straightened, wiping her face with the sleeve of her uniform. The evidence bag sat on the passenger seat, still intact. It felt heavier now, weighted with Noah's sacrifice, with the lives of the people in those photographs, and with the fragile threads of justice that still clung to it. Isabella took out her phone, her thumb hovering over the contact list, before selecting a name, Captain Elaine Monroe. But she didn't press call. Trust had become a scarce commodity. Instead, she leaned back, her eyes staring blankly through the windshield as the past clawed its way into her mind. 5 years earlier, the precinct was alive with movement, fluorescent lights buzzing overhead, and the faint smell of burnt coffee lingering in the air. A younger officer, Isabella Torres, sat at her desk, trying to focus on the mountain of paperwork in front of her. Torres, a deep voice boomed across the bullpen. She looked up to see Detective Noah Grant striding toward her, a manila folder in one hand and his usual scowl plastered across his face. His greying hair was mussed, and dark circles rimmed his eyes, but there was a sharpness in his gaze that always commanded attention. "You're with me," he said, dropping the folder onto her desk. "Double homicide near the docks." "Bring your vest, yes, sir," she replied, grabbing her gear and falling in. Step beside him in the car. Noah drove in. Silence, the distant hum of the police radio filling the space between them. "Noah, do you ever wonder if we're really making a difference?" Isabella asked, her voice quiet. Noah sighed deeply, his hands gripping the wheel. "Every damn day, Torres. But you know what keeps me going?" She shook her head. "It's the small wins, the mother who gets her kid back, the guy who gets justice for his brother, the days when we actually do make a difference, even if it's just once in a while." They arrived at the scene, 2 bodies sprawled in an abandoned shipping container, execution style. Isabella's stomach churned at the sight, but she kept her face stoic as Noah inspected the scene. "People like this," Noah muttered, gesturing at the lifeless bodies. "They're just pawns in a much bigger game. And the people pulling the strings, they're never here, they're in offices, behind desks, wearing suits, worth more than our salaries. Combined, what do we do, then?" Isabella asked. Noah turned to her, his expression grave. "We keep digging, Torres, even when they tell us to stop." Present day. The memory faded, leaving Isabella staring out into the empty woods. Noah had lived by those words, and now he was dead. Because of them, she pulled the evidence box from the passenger seat and carefully spread the contents across her lap. The photographs, the documents, the tarnished badge. All pieces of a puzzle so large it felt impossible to complete. One document caught her eye, a handwritten note tucked into the folds of a bank statement. "Warehouse, 17 midnight, they'll move everything." Her chest tightened. That was where Noah had told her to go before the attack. That was where the answers were waiting. Rex let out a low growl, his ears pinned back as he stared out the window. "Someone's here," she muttered, her hand flying to her Glock. The sound of an engine rumbling in the distance grew louder. Isabella shoved the documents back into the bag and reached for her radio dispatch. "This is Officer Torres, possible hostile activity near Route 18 wooded area, requesting immediate backup, static crack." Tealed on the other end. No response. "Damn it," she hissed. She leaned across the passenger seat, opening the glove compartment and pulling out a spare magazine. "Rex, stay close." The SUV came into view, through the trees, its headlights slicing through the early morning fog. It stopped about 50 yards away, engine idling. The driver's side door opened, and a figure stepped out. A tall man in a dark coat. Isabella squinted, recognizing the silhouette, Sergeant Tom Delaney. Her pulse spiked, and her grip tightened on her weapon. "Officer Torres," Delaney called out, his voice carrying across the distance. "We need to talk." "Stay right there," Isabella barked, raising her Glock. Delaney raised his hand slowly, his expression calm but cold. "This doesn't have to end badly, Torres. Just hand over the evidence and we can all walk away." "You killed Noah," she said through clenched teeth. Delaney sighed, shaking his head. "Noah was stubborn too. Stubborn, but you..." You still have a choice." "No," she said firmly. "I don't." Delaney's calm expression cracked his eyes, narrowing. "Then you've made your choice." He whistled sharply, and 3 more figures emerged from the trees, rifles in hand. "Rex, run!" Isabella shouted. Gunfire erupted as Isabella dove behind her car. Rex bolted into the woods. A blur of fur and muscle glass shattered, and bullets punched into metal. Isabella fired back, her heart hammering in her chest. "Keep moving, Rex," she yelled. The woods became a battleground of smoke, gunfire, and chaos. Isabella's hands were steady on her weapon as she moved from cover to cover, her eyes darting toward the tree line. "Rex." She called again. A sharp bark cut through the chaos, followed by a sudden silence. Her stomach dropped. "No, no, no, no!" But she couldn't stop. She couldn't go back. She had to keep moving with one final glance toward the trees. She turned and ran deeper into the woods, clutching the evidence bag against her chest. If she stopped now, everything Noah had died for would be in vain. The forest was silent now, the echo of gunfire swallowed by the dense canopy of leaves overhead. Morning light filtered weakly through the mist, painting the world in pale greys and greens. Isabella's boots squelched against damp earth as she moved cautiously through the underbrush, the evidence bag clutched tightly against her chest. Her Glock was gripped in her other hand, her finger resting lightly on the trigger. "Rex!" she hissed, her voice barely above a whisper. No response. Her heart hammered in her chest as panic clawed at the edges of her mind. She'd heard him bark. Sharp, urgent before the silence, she crouched behind a fallen tree, her breath coming in. Shallow gasps, every twig snap, every rustle of leaves felt like an ambush waiting to happen. Her phone was dead, her radio useless in this remote stretch of woods. Her fingers brushed over the evidence bag, feeling the weight of everything Noah had died for. The photographs, the documents, the badge. It was all here, but none of it would matter if she didn't make it out alive. Torres thinks she closed her eyes, trying to slow her breathing, trying to focus. If Delaney's men were still hunting her, they wouldn't stop until she was dead and the evidence was buried again. A faint noise broke through the silence. A soft whimper. "Rex?" She whispered, her eyes snapping open. She crept forward, stepping carefully over roots and stones. The sound grew clearer, a low, pained when her stomach twisted as she pushed aside a branch and spotted him. Rex lay at the base of an old oak tree, one paw stretched out awkwardly, his sid smeared with blood. His chest rose and fell in shallow breaths, and his amber eyes met hers, filled with both pain and trust. "Oh God, Rex." She holstered her gun and dropped to her knees beside him, her hands trembling as she examined his wound, a graze from a bullet just above his shoulder. It wasn't fatal, but the blood loss was serious. "You're okay, boy. You're okay," she said softly, her voice cracking from her utility belt. She pulled out a small first aid kit and quickly fashioned a bandage, pressing gauze against the wound to stop the bleeding. Rex whimpered, but stayed still, his eyes never leaving her face. "You saved me again, didn't you?" she whispered, stroking his ear. The sound of voices carried faintly through the trees. They were still searching. Isabella's hands shook as she tightened the makeshift bandage and adjusted the evidence bag across her shoulder. We have to move, Rex. I know you're hurt, but we can't stop here." Rex pushed himself up, slowly, letting out a faint whine but managing to stand. He leaned against her leg, his weight heavy but steady. Together, they moved deeper into the forest, Isabella keeping one hand on her Glock and the other lightly resting on Rex's harness. The forest seemed endless, the air growing colder as they pressed on. Hours later, they stumbled upon an old hunting cabin hidden in a clearing. The structure was weathered and leaning slightly to one side, its windows covered with grime. Smoke curled faintly from a rusted chimney, and the faint glow of firelight spilled through a crack in the wooden shutters. Isabella hesitated, scanning the area for any signs of movement. "Come on, Rex, we need shelter." She approached the cabin carefully. Her Glock raised, the wooden door creaked as she pushed it open with her shoulder, and she stepped inside with Rex, close at her heels. The interior was sparse, but warm. A fire crackled in a small stone fireplace, and a battered couch sat nearby. A table was pushed against the far wall, cluttered with empty cans and scattered maps. "Anyone here?" Isabella called out, no answer. She lowered her weapon slightly, glancing around. Whoever had been here recently wasn't around now. "All right, boy, let's patch you up properly." She knelt beside Rex near the firelight, pulling off her jacket and folding it into a makeshift pillow. For him, his eyes fluttered closed briefly, exhaustion and pain clear in every line of his body as she worked on cleaning and rebanding his wound. Her mind kept circling back to the same question. What now? Her phone was dead, her radio useless. She couldn't call for backup, couldn't trust anyone at the precinct, and couldn't go back to the city without risking another ambush. The bag sat on the table, its contents still damning, still dangerous. Her gaze fell on one document sticking slightly out of the envelope, a shipping manifest. The name Councilman Edward Blake was scrolled across it next to his name. Another note, warehouse 17, final drop, midnight tonight. She sat back, her hands trembling. That was it, the thread she needed to pull, but could she risk it? Could she walk straight into what was undoubtedly a trap? Her eyes drifted to Rex, who had drifted into an uneasy sleep, his bandaged side rising and falling with each shallow breath. "If I don't stop them, if I let this slip away more, people will die. More lives will be buried under the weight of their greed." But the weight of fear sat heavy in her chest. She had almost lost Rex. She had already lost Noah. How much more could she give before she broke completely? For a long time she sat in the flickering fur light, the sound of the wind outside pressing against the thin walls of the cabin. When she finally stood, her shoulders squared and her jaw set, she felt a cold calm settle over her. She reached out and rested her hand gently on Rex's head. His eyes opened slightly, and his tail gave a weak wag. "We're going to the docks, buddy. Warehouse 17. We're ending this tonight." Rex's tail wagged again, stronger this time, and his eyes met hers with something close to determination. She crossed the room, pulled an old map from the cluttered table, and began tracing the route to the docks. Midnight was only hours away, and the clock was ticking as the fire crackled behind her and the wind howled outside. Isabella Torres prepared herself for the final chapter of the story, a chapter written in shadows, secrets and the unwavering loyalty of a dog who refused to stop fighting. The moon hung low over Riverside's industrial docks, its pale light shimmering on the inky black water below, where House 17 loomed like a hulking metal beast. At the edge of the pier, its rust-streaked walls illuminated by faint floodlights, the sharp scent of salt water mixed with the distant hum of machinery and the occasional crackle of a walkie-talkie. Isabella crouched behind a stack of cargo crates across the lot, her eyes locked on the warehouse entrance. Rex sat low beside her, his bandaged side wrapped tightly, his amber eyes sharp and alert. "All right, buddy," she whispered, her breath fogging in the cold night air. "This is it, one way or another. It ends." Tonight her Glock was firm in her hand, her spare magazine strapped to her belt. The evidence bag was secured tightly to her back. Every instinct in her body screamed at her to turn around to run, but Noah's voice echoed in her mind. "We keep digging, Torres, even when they tell us to stop." She exhaled slowly and scanned the perimeter. 2 guards stood near the main entrance, their rifles hanging. Loosely from their shoulders, another pair patrolled the perimeter, their movements casual but alert. Rex let out a soft growl, his body coiled like a spring easy boy. She murmured, We'll wait for our opening." She glanced at her watch. 11:45 p.m. 15 minutes until midnight. Whatever was happening inside, it was going to happen soon. A loud engine rumbled in the distance. Isabella's head snapped up as a black SUV approached the warehouse, its headlights cutting sharp beams across the cracked pavement. The vehicle came to a stop and the rear door opened. Councilman Edward Blake stepped out, his tailored coat flaring slightly in the night wind. He was flanked by two men in dark suits, both carrying briefcases. Blake adjusted his cufflinks as he walked toward the entrance, his calm demeanor oozing control. Right behind him, another figure emerged, Sergeant Tom Delaney. Isabella's stomach turned to stone. Delaney's cold, calculating stare swept the lot before he gestured to the guards. The men opened the warehouse doors, revealing a dimly lit interior filled with towering stacks of crates and the faint, metallic scent of money showtime. Isabella muttered. She tapped Rex lightly on the shoulder. "Stay close, but quiet." They slipped from their hiding spot, hugging the shadows as they made their way toward the side entrance of the warehouse. Rex moved silently beside her, his paws barely making a sound on the concrete. Isabella pressed her back against the cold metal siding, taking a deep breath before inching open the side door. It creaked softly as she slipped inside. Her weapon, raised inside the warehouse, was cavernous, filled with crates stacked to the ceiling and dimly lit by a handful of overhead bulbs. The sound of faint conversation and the occasional metallic clang echoed through the space. Isabella crouched behind a crate, peering through a narrow gap. Blake stood near a long metal table, stacks of cash piled high in front of him. Delaney stood nearby, arms crossed, his expression blank. "This is the last transfer," Blake said calmly, his voice carrying in the hollow space. "After tonight we vanish accounts, wiped names, erased the loose ends tied up." Delaney nodded, his jaw tight, and Torres the dog. Blake's lip curled into a smirk. "If she's still alive." "She won't be for long." Rex growled softly beside her, and Isabella pressed a hand gently against his neck. "Not yet." Blake turned and gestured to one of the crates on the table. A man in a black coat stepped forward, cracked open the crate, and revealed stacks of bundled cash and black duffel bags filled with small, metallic objects. "Guns," Isabella whispered. This wasn't just about bribes, it was about weapons trafficking. She reached into her backpack, pulling out a small body cam she'd grabbed from her patrol car earlier. With shaking hands, she activated it and set it carefully on the crate beside her, ensuring it had a clear view of the table. She couldn't let them leave this warehouse. Isabella steadied her Glock, her finger resting lightly on the trigger. She could take out Delaney first. He was the most dangerous. Then Blake. Her heartbeat thundered in her ears as she counted down in her head. 3, 2, 1. She stood, stepped into view and shouted, "Police, drop your weapons!" Chaos exploded. Blake stumbled backward, knocking over a stack of cash. Delaney's hand flew to his sidearm, but Isabella fired first. One clean shot to his shoulder, he cried out, staggering backward as his weapon clattered to the floor. Rex surged forward, teeth, bead launching himself at one of the armed guards. The man went down screaming as Rex's powerful jaws clamped onto his arm. Gunfire erupted, bullets sparking against crates and steel beams. Isabella dove behind a crate, firing 2 more rounds, dropping another guard. "Get her!" Blake roared, scrambling for cover behind the table. Rex dragged the guard down, shaking him viciously before leaping toward another attacker. Isabella fired again, her Glock clicking empty as the final round was spent. A guard lunged at her from the side, tackling her to the ground. Her head cracked against the concrete, and stars burst behind her eyes. The guard raised his rifle, but Rex was faster. He slammed into the man's teeth, sinking into his shoulder, tearing him away from Isabella. She scrambled to her feet, grabbing the fallen rifle. Rex, back the German Shepherd, obeyed, falling into place beside her, his chest heaving. Blood smeared across his muzzle. Blake stood, frozen, his hands raised slightly, sweat pouring down his face. "It's over, Blake," Isabella said, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. "No, Torres, you're wrong." From the corner of her eye, she saw Delaney stagger to his feet, blood streaming down his arm as he raised a pistol. She didn't hesitate, one shot, clean and sharp. Delaney fell, his weapon clattering across the floor. Blake dropped to his knees, his face pale. "You can't stop this," he whispered. "You think this ends with me. You think shut up." The distant sound of sirens began to grow louder, red and blue lights flashing faintly through the warehouse. Windows, Isabella's shoulders sagged as exhaustion threatened to pull her under. She lowered the rifle slightly, her eyes flicking to Rex. "You did good, buddy," she whispered. The warehouse doors burst open, officers flooding the space with weapons drawn. Captain Elaine Monroe strode in her sharp eyes, scanning the carnage before landing on Isabella. "Officer Torres." She barked, "Over here." Monroe approached her, gaze flicking to Blake, then Delaney's lifeless body. "Get him out of here," Monroe said, gesturing to Blake as two officers dragged him to his feet. Isabella dropped to one knee beside Rex, resting a trembling hand on his head. "It's over," she said softly. The weight of everything, the fear, the loss, the bloodshed, pressed down on her shoulders, but for the first time in days the air felt lighter. Justice had been served. The sky over Riverside was painted in hues of pink and orange as dawn broke over the city. The cold wind carried the distant hum of traffic and the faint echo of sirens. Warehouse 17 was now a chaotic scene. Police cruisers and SWAT vans lined the perimeter. Red and blue lights flashing against the rust-stained walls. Officers moved with focused urgency, cataloguing evidence, photographing bodies, and escorting Councilman Edward Blake into the back of a police cruiser. Isabella sat on the edge of an ambulance bumper, her uniform stained with dirt sweat, and blood-imp paramedic was wrapping her bruised knuckles in gauze while she stared blankly at the shattered remains of the night. Rex lay at her feet, his head resting on his outstretched paws. His bandaged side rose and fell steadily as he slept, exhaustion pulling him under. Despite the chaos around them, Captain Elaine Monroe approached, her boots clicking against the concrete. She held the evidence bag tightly in one hand, her expression unreadable. "Officer Torres," Monroe said, her voice cutting through the noise. Isabella looked up, her bloodshot eyes locking onto Monroe's sharp gaze. "You did good tonight," Monroe said softly, holding up the bag. This will burn the whole rotten tree down." Isabella exhaled, a tremor in her breath. "Noah, he didn't make it." Monroe's face softened slightly, a flicker of grief passing through her eyes. "No, he didn't, but his sacrifice wasn't in vain. We've got Blake. We've got enough evidence to drag every last one of them into the light." For a moment they stood in silence, the weight of everything hanging heavy in the cool morning air. "Get some rest," Torres, Monroe said. "Finally, you've earned it." As Monroe walked away, Isabella glanced down at Rex. His tail thumped faintly against the pavement, as if reassuring her. "Come on, buddy," she whispered. "Let's go home." The next few days were a blur of debriefings, paperwork, and press conferences. The city was alight with headlines: Councilman Edward Blake arrested in corruption scandal, hero, officer, and K9 expose widespread conspiracy and justice in Riverside, the truth uncovered. Isabella attended Noah's funeral. 2 days later, it was a cold, grey morning. The cemetery was silent except for the occasional rustle of leaves in the wind and the quiet sobs of those in attendance. She stood by his grave. Rex sitting quietly beside her, his head bowed. The folded flag was still tucked under her arm as she stared down at the polished stone marker. Detective Noah Grant, a light in the darkness, a voice for the silenced. Her voice cracked as she spoke softly, almost to herself. "You were right, Noah, the small wins, they're worth it, even when they hurt." Rex nudged her hand gently, and she turned away, walking slowly back to her car. A week later, Riverside felt quieter, cleaner somehow, but the scars left behind by the scandal would take years to fade. Isabella sat on a worn-out park bench, staring out at the small pond in Riverside Park. Rex sat beside her, his tail wagging faintly as he watched ducks float lazily across the water. "You know, buddy," she said softly, rubbing the spot behind his ears, "you could have ignored that scent. You could have let someone else find that box." Rex tilted his head slightly as if listening. "But you didn't. You just kept digging. You knew something wasn't right. And you wouldn't let it go." Her phone buzzed in her pocket. A message from Monroe: charges filed. "Blake and Delaney's network is crumbling. We did it, Torres." She smiled faintly, tucking the phone away. A little girl walked past with her mother pointing at Rex with wide eyes. "Look, Mummy, that's the hero dog from the news," Isabella chuckled as the girl waved shyly before skipping away. "Hero dog? Huh," she said, looking down at Rex. "They've got that right." Rex let out a soft huff, his tail thumping against the grass. The sun dipped lower in the sky, casting long shadows across the park. For the first time in weeks, Isabella felt like she could breathe again. Her radio crackled softly from her HIP Unit 47 report to Sector 9 possible disturbance report. Ed Isabella aside, pushing herself to her feet. Duty Call's partner Rex stood stretching his front legs before falling into step beside her. They walked back toward her patrol car, the weight of the past weeks lingering in the fading light, but not holding them down, as she opened the car door and Rex jumped in. Isabella paused, looking back at the park, the place where everything had started. "Sometimes the truth doesn't stay buried," she said softly. More to herself than anyone else, she slid into the driver's seat, started the engine and pulled out onto the quiet streets of Riverside. The city had its problems, it always would, but tonight it felt just a little bit safer, and somewhere in the fading light of day, a woman and her dog, partners survivors, heroes, drove into the horizon, ready to face whatever came next.